assume that there's this sort of one size fits all way to create a sense of belonging, to support Black students on these campuses, and that's not true. I also do a lot of work on racial attitudes and public opinion, and so if you know, in the 2016 presidential election, in particular, you saw, you know, a lot of concern because, I don't know, 5 additional Black people voted Republican. And you see all of this conversation about, well, you know, when you have more immigrant Blacks in the US population than you had before, like you might lose political solidarity among Blacks. And so that has also been a question that has been interesting to me. And so this project was actually a way for me to be attentive to those things, and you know, sort of pursue my scholarship, but also sort of pursue what is mission critical or sort of part of my core values. So the book is called Young, Gifted, and Diverse, and it is precisely what it says it is. We call it Origins in the New Black Elite. We're thinking about elite status more in terms of the credential, right? A college degree from a highly selective college or university. The name, he's right, I like fun names, is obviously after the Lorraine Hansberry quote, that there was a song that Nina Simone performed. That song was then recorded by Aretha Franklin. It has been sampled by all kinds of R&B and hip hop. So it's an important, I think, part of a Black cultural experience in the United States. So we cover a lot in the book. And so what I want to do today really is to kind of give you the historical perspective and why it is that I felt it was so important to document the changes in the Black student population on these campuses. And I should say the 28 colleges and universities range from Ivy and Ivy peers. So Penn and Princeton are part of this. We have elite liberal arts colleges like Rice University, Williams. We have flagship state universities like Cal Berkeley, Penn State. We have University of Michigan, Duke, Emory. There are different, and I think Yale is part of it. So it's those kinds of institutions, again, where that credential actually provides entree into circles and garners respect and all of those kinds of things. In a particular way, I should say. We only got one HBCU to participate, so Howard is the only HBCU among this group. We did ask 3 others, Morehouse, Spelman, and Xavier, and Xavier turned us down. Morehouse and Spelman said they were going to participate, and then they ghosted us. This is what we have. When we can say things about Howard, we do. So what I'm going to do is kind of go over demographic trends in the Black population in the 20th century that sort of have led to this diversity. And then I'm going to share with you just the diversity among the students in these 28 colleges and universities. And again, Penn is one of the universities that we studied. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a few findings that I think are sort of relevant for things that are happening on campuses now. Arrow down. No, will this one work? There we go. So thinking historically, there's been this huge transformation in the Black population across several dimensions. Gender is one, where we see beginning in 1980, a divergence in the college-going population. So starting in about 1980, you see that females who are the dotted line show a continuous increase in college attainment that is higher than for males, so that by 2019, you had about 20% of men and 25% of women who were college educated in the Black population. And if you look all the way back to 1940, it was only 1.4%. So again, this is sort of the first dimension of diversity that we were interested in, because it does have implications for the composition of the Black student population and understanding differences in their experiences. The second trend is socioeconomic class status, and there is the rise of what we're calling a Black professional class. So we know there was an expansion of the middle class, but there's also a rise in what we call a Black professional class, which is more sort of white collar, higher income, and entree into professions that had once been excluded, Blacks had been excluded from. This is a really modest measure if we think about household income, because it's really only Black households over $100,000. And I think we know today that doesn't feel like elite status. But you can still see that since 1972, there's been five-fold increase in the percentage of Black households with incomes over $100,000. Diasporic immigration is the next dimension that we paid a lot of attention to. So whether or not students are born in the United States, and then which immigrant generation are they, and then where they come from. So historically, what we can see is that in 1970, about 1.1% of Blacks in the United States were foreign born, but by 2019, that was 11%. So there's an 11-fold increase there. And then that has implications for the second generation. And then interracial marriage and the multicultural movement. Okay, so we focused here on the percentage of Black marriages with a white spouse, and we did that because that is the bulk of interracial marriages in the Black interracial marriages in the United States. And you can see that as recently as 2000, there was 1.4% of Black interracial marriages, and it is now 13.3 as of 2020. And then finally, the composition of the Black multiracial population, we didn't start measuring that really until the year 2000. You can see that the bulk of them, almost 70%, are listing white as their non-Black parent. And then about 6% to 6.5% are saying Black, white, and American Indian, or Black and American Indian. Smaller percentages are listing any of the other pairings. Okay, so that sort of gives you a sense. We don't know what the multiracial population looked like before 2000 because we didn't ask questions that way, right? But we do know that one of the things we used to do was to use skin tone to understand stratification in the Black community. We knew that lighter skinned Blacks on average had higher incomes, greater educational attainment, and the like. And we often assumed that that was a consequence of being mixed race, even though Black folks at least know that you can not be able to point to a white ancestor and still be very fair skinned. So it wasn't a great indicator. So what I'm going to do is use some pie charts this time to give you a sense of what the Black students in our study looked like. So these are great places to study mixed race people because they're overrepresented on these campuses. So about 84% of the students said they were Black and only Black. And I should say they all screened in because we got a sampling list from the registrar. So they had all checked Black on their college applications, but toward the end of the first wave of the survey, we asked them how they identified themselves, and they could check mixed, and then they could write in whatever they wanted. So 16% of them said that they were mixed, and there were about 1,000 participants in this study. I guess I should tell you that too. 64% of those mixed race kids had a white parent. 13% had a Latino parent. 14.5% had an Asian parent, and then about 8.5% had some other, and maybe listed multiple. In terms of nativity and generational status, about 73% of these students are third generation or more in the US. And again, remember, about 11% of Blacks are foreign born. So the first generation immigrants are the foreign born. They're only about 8.5%. In 1999, that may have been close to what was true in the United States. The much bigger share is the second generation immigrant students, who are nearly 20% of the Black student population across these 28 colleges and universities. In terms of regional origin, half of them come from the Caribbean, and a third come from Africa, and about 16% come from various other places. And if we break it down by country, Nigeria and Ghana are the two biggest senders, but there's a huge difference. So 21% are from Nigeria, but only about 8% are from Ghana. And then the biggest senders for Caribbean students are Jamaica and Haiti. So Jamaica is about 22% and Haiti is about 11%, and then it gets smaller from there. Okay, skin tone. We asked I'm happy to answer questions about how we ask certain things, and Black respondents were interviewed by Black interviewers. So that is usually the big question about this one, is like who was deciding what their skin tone was. You can see about half of the students were classified as medium. We had a 1 to 10 scale. So these were the sort of 4, 5, and 6s. And then about a quarter each are on the light and the dark ends. And they're about 2/3 female and 1/3 male. Okay, so part of what I wanted you to see, the last piece would be parental education, right? So, you know, the big issue here is that when these institutions tend to think about Black students, they tend to think poor, they tend to think urban, they tend to think underprepared, right? And all of those kinds of things. And I think when we think about elite status, we tend to think about the students who come here and their parents came here and their siblings came here or went to similar schools. What I wanted to be able to document is that a lot of us who go on to have elite status didn't have all of those things, but a lot of us did. So about 41% of the Black students in our sample have at least one parent with an advanced degree. About 32% have at least one college-educated parent, and about 27% have neither parent has completed a college degree. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of parental education and the extent to which they have been raised in a culture of college going and what one might expect to happen for them when they go to college. And so I used the charts really because they have lots of colors, and I think it's a really good way to just give you a general sense of how much diversity there was, right? Because it's everywhere. Every chart has a bunch of colors because one of the things we concluded from our first book was that if you were walking down, Locust Walk and ran into a random Black student and had to make some guess about their backgrounds, we would probably be wrong every time, because there was more diversity across all of the dimensions than any of the other kinds of students in our sample. They were more diverse than the Asian students, they were more diverse than the Latino students, and they were certainly more diverse than the white students because they're pretty homogeneous. Okay, so the other sort of areas of diversity have to do with their experiences of segregation, because I can't help myself. Segregation impacts all aspects of American life. And so it certainly impacts people's experiences in elite higher education. When I came to Penn, one of the first things that struck me, I taught a Summer Institute course on segregation, and the number of students who were familiar with a concentrated minority neighborhood were actually relatively small. And again, it goes against stereotype, right? I had to kind of check my own understandings. I spend so much time looking at the statistics that I'm not thinking about the context that I find myself in. So here again, you see a lot of diversity. So about a little over a third of these students come from predominantly white neighborhoods. So those are neighborhoods that are no more than 30% non-white. Another roughly third come from racially mixed, and I should say it's neighborhoods and schools. So it's the average of the two. And then about 24%, almost a quarter, come from concentrated minority neighborhoods and schools. And then that little purple piece, that 9% are students who come from concentrated minority neighborhoods, but they attend predominantly white high schools. So this captures not only this sort of ABC, a better chance or prep for prep kind of experience, but it also captures students who went to predominantly white public magnet schools or other independent schools in their areas. And what we found was that even those that went to a white public school have experiences and belief patterns that are quite similar to the ones who would go off to elite private boarding schools. This you don't have to focus as much on. So this is really, we paid attention to social disorganization and violence in their neighborhoods, because segregation concentrates poverty, and in concentrated poverty communities, you see more violence and social disorganization. It is not about the color of the neighborhood, it's about the class status of the neighborhood. And so these are weighted indices of exposure to social disorder and violence. So it can be things as simple as trash on the street or graffiti on the bathroom walls at school. It can include seeing prostitution. It can include seeing people being mugged or in fights. And what you can see is that as segregation increases, that exposure to violence and social disorder also increases. And what I can tell you from our first book is that this right here is about 17 times the level of violence and social disorder that the typical white student experiences in their neighborhood and school. And this here is still also, as I recall, about 9 or 10% more. So even Blacks who come from predominantly white neighborhoods, probably more affluence, are still seeing more violence and social disorder in their neighborhoods and schools. And that again is consistent with the segregation literature. And then what you see with the kids who lived in minority neighborhoods but attended white schools, that school experience doesn't really shield them from the violence and disorder that they're seeing in their neighborhoods. So one of the things that can happen if you're coming from a segregated experience and you come to these predominantly white institutions is culture shock. In addition to the survey instrument, we have interviews with Black students at 2 of the institutions, Penn and Princeton. And so we actually weave qualitative data in with our quantitative data. And so this student, Thomas, says, as a college student, I felt out of place often, especially being a member of an elite off-campus club that only has 3 Black people. There are country nights and bling bling nights at the club, which make me uncomfortable for different reasons. I've just accepted that I'm going to be one of a few Black people at these places. The culture shock of being up north with mainly white people has been the hardest part of adjusting to college. I don't know if I will ever fully adjust. And this is a kid who is middle class and lived in predominantly white neighborhoods and went to predominantly white schools, and yet is struggling with this part of his transition to college. We also sort of looked at, and I hate to say this, what we call the downsides of mobility. So I wanted to pay attention to experiences of racial hostility on campus and other things that actually aren't so great about college. And so this table is basically telling us that no matter how we break down the data, you've got, there were 11 kinds of hostile experiences that students could experience. And they had to do with, it could happen with students, it could happen with professors, it could happen with public safety. And what you can see is that the average student across all of these characteristics experiences between 3 and 5 experiences across 4 years. The mean frequency of occurrence varies from 0 to 44. And so typically what happens is that for any individual experience, the average is kind of rarely. And so when you add all of these up over the course of 4 years of college, it's roughly an experience a year. For some students, it won't be a big deal. It'll roll right off their backs. But for others, the accumulation of those kinds of things can be a pretty big burden to carry. So a couple of students responded to this. One said, the darker your skin is, the more trouble you're going to have. Daryl is a multi-generational native from a poor family, from a segregated minority neighborhood, but he attended an elite, predominantly white boarding school. He is actually a student who ended up taking a leave while he was at school, and actually you'll hear from him again before we're done. This is Richard, who's a second-generation Caribbean student from an integrated background and a predominantly white private high school. And he says it just feels awkward sometimes, like interacting with classmates, how they might not talk to you after class. You see them in the campus center and you're like, hey, and they just walk past. Herman's nodding like, I don't know, I have that experience on campus. So another thing we looked at was performance burden. This speaks to Claude Steele's notions of stereotype threat. And the idea that just by being a person of color from a marginalized group in this academic setting sort of primes us and causes a kind of anxiety that negatively impacts academic performance. We actually found two different kinds of performance burden, one that originates from race-based performance burden and another that's sort of family-oriented. Olivia, who's a second-generation Haitian Nigerian immigrant, says, a lot of my Black friends say they can't afford to go have fun here. They really have to get an education and use it. It's not a place to find yourself. It's time to make a move and get out. Pick a career and start doing things for yourself and start paying back your loans. There's no time for switching majors. I feel like a lot of white students can afford to spend an extra year here or just switch their majors a couple of times. Financially, they have that option. And it's not just seen as you need to come out of here with something solid to work with. And then Julie says, I was sitting in class today and there were these white guys. No, they were actually Asians, but like people who talk about, oh, I'm not going to class today, I just don't feel like it. I know I have those times, but I know I'd always feel really bad about it because my parents struggled for me to be here. Why am I throwing this sacrifice away by not going to class? I know for me, going to college is very, very important because there are a lot of people in my family who haven't and who never did, and I'm one of the firsts. And again, Julie is a monoracial, multi-general native from a segregated neighborhood and an integrated school, and she's working class. And so thinking about that performance burden, as I said, there was a race-based like questions like, if I perform poorly in class, my professor will think less of people like me. So it would be those kinds of questions. You know, on the family side, they were things like, my family is sacrificing a lot for me to be here. It's really important to make my family proud. And family-based stereotype or performance burden was actually always higher. So whether you were native or immigrant, monoracial, mixed race, low income, high income, the means on those items were between 7 and 8 for family-based performance burden, where the means were 4 and 5, and these are both on 10-point scales for the race-based performance burden. So they're really being hit twice, right? So there's the concern about how is this professor thinking about other people like me if I don't do well, if I don't ask questions, if I don't do this or that, and how are other classmates thinking about people like me? And then on the flip, and then going along with that is the pressure that students feel because their parents have sacrificed a lot for them to be here, or they're the first ones in their families to come to college and they can't mess it up. And all of that can have implications for their work. Stressful life events. So these are things like deaths, unemployment, homelessness, sibling getting pregnant, somebody being the victim of crime. You know, so that I think the least stressful event on the scale was a sibling dropping out of school. These are also weighted. So the most stressful event was the death of an immediate family member, which scored like an 82. And then the least stressful event was a sibling dropping out of school, which was about a 26. So you weight by severity, and then you ask, did you experience these things? We asked that across all 4 years of college. What you can see in the first column here is that the mean number of stressful life events that students experienced is 4.7 across all of the various dimensions of diversity. Everybody is over 4. Those from no college backgrounds have an average of 6 stressful life events a year. If you look at the second column, it gives you the mean weighted severity of the stress across 4 years, and it's all between the 240s and the highest one is 336, I believe. So the average is 275.6. Remember, the most severe thing that could happen was a death, and that was 82. So for Black students, they're experiencing something severe every year, at least. They might, it could be that it's concentrated in 2 years, but on average, they've got something happening every year and a little more because it's 4.7. And it's of a severity that is worse than a death of an immediate family member. Okay. What I can tell you about the white students from our first book, their averages were always in the low 100s, and they experienced 1 or 2 across 4 years of college on average. So it was nothing like this. And what you can see is that the differences are bigger for parental education. So no college background is almost 100 points higher than those with an advanced degree. And that those coming from segregated minority neighborhoods and schools have the highest severity, right? So all of that is consistent with what we know about the consequences of segregation and low income and the absence of wealth. Because I think it's also important to note that those with an advanced degree who are the highest income families are still experiencing 1 event a year with an average score of 250. And then mental health, I used to cry a lot. I used to call my friends a lot. I used to sleep a lot. Like, instead of going to lunch in the dining hall, I would come back to my room and I would sleep that half hour. It's not borderline depression, but I know that sleeping is a symptom of depression. I was kind of an introvert. Now I had to come here and get to know people, and it was really, really hard for me to do. This is Nia, a second-generation Caribbean student from a predominantly white neighborhood and school, an affluent family. Brian, who is also second-generation Caribbean, lower middle class, but white neighborhood and school, says, like, pretty much like the whole thing where, like everyone from their high school class is like valedictorian and like they made straight A's and all that stuff. And then you come to a place and everyone's doing like 8,000 things more than you. That's very like difficult, very humbling. It's probably like the most humbling experience I've ever had, and it's been pretty tough. I think we all know that's a Penn student. So we use the depression scale. Anybody that sees a therapist knows you go in and they ask you to fill things out about how you have felt over a recent period of time. I've really demarcated these top ones because 2/3 or more of the respondents reported experiencing each of those things, feeling too tired to do things, having trouble keeping focused on tasks, difficulty getting started on things, felt happy, which we actually reverse coded to be not happy. So felt sad, talked less than usual, was bothered by things that usually don't bother me. Okay, it goes down with feeling lonely, didn't feel like eating or had a poor appetite, thought life had been a failure, felt life was not worth living. And even then, that's the one that had the least resonance for students, but 11% of them said they felt that way. An average on a 0 to 3 scale, you can see that some of them are up around 2. And so on average, you've got 59% or 60% of students who are experiencing these things on a regular basis. We calculated their depression scores. It was a scale of 0 to 57. The actual scale is 0 to 60, but the highest score we got was a 57. And you'll notice that all of these mean scores here are between 17 and 20. A score of 19 is generally considered to be at risk for major depression. So on average, most of these students are at risk for depression. And so the last column there is the percentage of students who were at risk of moderate depression. And again, I would show it to you by these categories. I think the thing to point out is that here's where the biggest differences are, and it's with the immigrant and Native kids, and then with men and women. So that women are like 10% more likely to be at risk for depression. And then among, if you think about nativity, generation, and region of origin, the immigrant kids are much worse off than the Native Blacks are, the third generation kids. And so there's not much difference between first and second generation immigrant students. And then if you look at where they're from, that other immigrant category is kind of a mixed bag. So I don't do a lot with it, but you notice that 55.5% of African immigrants are at risk for major depression, as are 52% of Caribbean immigrant students. So, you know, at any given time, we're talking about nearly half of a population of students. So the last thing I'm going to talk about are sort of racial attitudes. I talked about political solidarity in the Black population more broadly. Every few years, Herman or I will get asked to moderate some discussion about why don't the immigrant Blacks just call themselves Black? Why do they have to be Nigerian or Ghanaian? You know, do they just not want to be associated with us? And these are the kinds of concerns that they have, right? And there's this issue around solidarity politics in particular. So we looked first at just sort of the relative importance of certain identities. So an American identity, a Black identity, or both of those identities equally. And you can see that over the course, and the darker bar is freshman year, the lighter bar is senior year. What you can see is that it's always the both and on, you know, the majority of students, but there is an increase in the number of students shifting to a straight Black identity. We also asked a linked fate question. So, you know, the extent to which you believe what happens to my group happens to me. You can see that over time, again, between freshman and senior year, the percentage saying that it matters a lot declines, and the percentage saying it matters none or a little actually increases. I think this is a sort of elite university exceptionalism that happens, where over time we're socializing these students to believe that if they could do it, those other people can do it too. And that rings true as we look at sort of social distance and stereotypes, where again, over the course, these are all Black respondents. These are their feelings of social closeness to Blacks, to whites, to Hispanics, and to Asians. And you can see there's not a lot of change on average over time. But what we did see is that there are subgroups who felt particular ways in time one, and they changed moving toward each other. So, for example, multiracial Blacks might not have felt as close to Blacks at the beginning of college, but they started to feel more close to Blacks by the end of college. And then alternatively, the monoracial Blacks might have felt more close to Blacks at the beginning of college, and they moved toward feeling a little less close. And so by the end of college, there is really no significant difference between any of those immigrants and non-immigrants, Africans and Caribbeans, low income and high income. By the time they finish college, they actually think quite similarly in terms of their racial attitudes. And that's true in terms of negative racial attitudes as well. And then the last one is the belief that whites tend to discriminate, right? That's really the only measure we had that made sense for their attitudes about whites. Interestingly, over the course of college, they become more inclined to think that whites tend to discriminate. And I think that, you know, if you think back to their experiences of racial hostility, we start to understand why. This last one is sort of explanations for inequality. So, you know, do I think that Blacks are less well off than whites because of structural factors, or do I tend to think it has something to do with Blacks themselves? Maybe they don't value education as much as whites do, or you know, and maybe they just are lazy in general, right? They're on the flip side, there's this idea that there's discrimination out there, or you think that Blacks have to be twice as good to get half as far. Those are the kinds of things we're capturing here. So again, dark bar is freshman year, light bar is senior year. To beat discrimination, Blacks must be more qualified. They believed that more as freshmen than they did as seniors. And again, these are 0 to 10 scales. Qualified Blacks will always lose jobs to whites. There's really no change there. And the last one, Blacks have only themselves to blame for not doing better. This one hurt because freshman year, they were more inclined to believe that. But over the course of college, hopefully because they took sociology and Africana Studies courses, they came to understand a different reality, right? So they moved more towards structural explanations for inequality by the end of college. Okay, the last thing I'm going to mention is, you know, not everybody's graduating in 4 years or even 6 years. And Blacks are more likely to take time off during college than a lot of other students, but they're not taking time off for the reasons that people think they're taking time off of college. So course too difficult is way down here. But what's at the top is the high cost, too much debt, lack of interest, lack of effort, and poor grades. If we think back to those depression items, we can understand the lack of interest, the lack of effort, and the poor grades. Okay, and then the last piece, I just wanted to talk about where the differences in graduation rates and taking time off are. And they are, to some degree, in terms of 4-year graduation, an immigrant, non-immigrant difference. The big differences are really at the bottom here. So the gender difference, the parental education difference, the segregation difference, and it's all what you would expect. Women are more likely to graduate than men. Those whose parents have an advanced degree are more likely to graduate than those who have no college in their backgrounds. And then those from segregated minority experiences are less likely to graduate than those who come from predominantly white neighborhoods and schools. So again, it all sort of tracks back to their experiences of segregation and social class disparities that, even if not in income here, are tied to wealth. And so what I'm going to say is, what I didn't talk about is the way that we started looking at the way all of those identities start to interact and intersect, so that, you know, I think we said a second generation immigrant Black female student from predominantly white neighborhoods and schools is the most likely to graduate in 4 years, and a multi-generational Native monoracial Black male from a segregated minority environment is least likely to graduate in even 6 years. But in between, there are all kinds of combinations of experiences. And that's what we try to capture in the book, and to really, again, to capture and describe the diversity and the beauty of that, but also what it means for understanding their experiences on these campuses, and then what it might mean when they leave these campuses and go out into the world, in terms of their access to opportunities. We're actually doing a small follow-up study to try to see how because these people all graduated before Barack Obama was president. So they experienced the Great Recession, Barack Obama, the Tea Party, Donald Trump, COVID, right? All during their prime labor market lives. And so what we want to see is how whether or not and what kind of differences across racial categories there are in the protective factors of elite college degrees. Because during the Great Recession, they were saying, you know, the unemployment rate among college educated people was 4%. But that's an average across everybody. That's not, you know, and so what we want to understand is how all of this then goes on to impact them in their adult lives. And we're going to go back and revisit some of their racial attitudes and other things. So I'm going to stop there. And I can't see a clock and answer any questions. So thank you for listening to my TED Talk. Please buy a book. And can somebody plug this in because my battery's about to die? Yeah, yeah, I can. And then what, afterwards you sign? I guess I am. Please buy books. I have another child going to college. I answered everybody's question. Yeah. I mean, that's fine if I did. Yeah, Alex.
Thank you. I think from your table when find a lot of people don't know about them and look for more information. Find out the case from your sample. Does it also vary? I'm curious how it varies by ethnicity and what communities.
So I think that, again, I think the bigger part of what happens is that when you come to these campuses, even if, so on average, when affluent Black people live around whites, they live around whites who make less money than they do. And then they come to a place like Penn or a place like Princeton, and they meet a whole other population of white people. And that experience is a little bit different. And so there's a sort of a proximity argument, right? You have to come into contact with people in order to experience discrimination. And I think that more of that happens when they come to these kinds of campuses. I think it's intensified by the competitive intellectual kind of orientation, right? Where everybody assumes that the Black students are here because of affirmative action, for example. And that when you get to these spaces where the competition was greatest to get in, you have people who are more likely to say that out loud, where now, you know, the average Black student hears it. So I think part of it is that. And the other piece, again, is that there's a sort of the kind of, and I think this plays out in the fact that you see that the belief in the tendency of whites to discriminate actually increases over the course of college. Again, now it's not just that they live on your street, it's that they actually live in your dorm, right? And maybe they're your roommate freshman year. And so there's a different kind of proximity, and now there's access to hearing different things and being and experiencing different things in interpersonal interactions that I think is just fundamentally different. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So any data collected on geography, locations of the participants in the study, whether it's from like South?
Yeah, so they're from everywhere. We have, I mean, that information exists, but it's not part of the data. I mean, it took us 12 years to finish this. And at one point we did at least, I think, track whether they were sort of, you know, West, Midwest, South. And that was not a dimension that was especially important. So we kind of focused on the ones that had the most demographic traction, but also, you know, had a story to tell. And that wasn't one of them. Yeah. You had a question. Mm-hmm. I don't even know. Okay, you were born, wait, were you born here? Then you're second generation. The way that, yeah, so I should explain that the way that demographers and sociologists generally measure generational status is first generation immigrants are born somewhere else and come here. And second generation immigrants are the children
Yeah.
who are born here, or they come at a very, very early age. So, I think kindergarten is kind of the cutoff for that. So that's the way that I've measured them here. So you would be in that second generation group if you had been if you were part of the study. Yeah. And I think the other piece to this is that around the time that our first book came out, where we noticed how many of the Black students were immigrant and second generation, it was around the time that Harvard also noticed that at their Black alumni event, a disproportionate number of their alums were also immigrant or second generation. And so that has also become a narrative. It is certainly something that the third or more generation US Black students are aware of. So they talk about how it feels like all of the students are immigrant students, or, I've had students come to my class and say, oh, I feel like I haven't seen another regular Black student all day, which, is just statistically impossible. But I think it does speak to the experience that they're having. And again, and then you sort of start to pile on, well, then they don't want to be Black. They don't refer to themselves as Black. It isn't enough for them to be in BSL. Like, as they have best friends who are Ghanaian and in the Ghanaian Student Association, or Jamaican and in the Caribbean Student Organization. But so there's the personal, the micro level, but then there's also this macro level where they are thinking politically and in terms of solidarity, and they see that as a threat. So. Yes, Barbara.
Thank you so much for this work.
Yeah. Yeah. And affirmative action. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That changes everything, and not just the students, but the father.
Right.
And I do think are beyond.
Yeah. As I said, at least for this group, it was true. Like if you looked at racial attitudes at the beginning of college, the immigrant Black students did have more negative views of Blacks than American Black students did. The sad part is that by the end of college, immigrant attitudes had improved and Native Black attitudes had worsened. And that's how that convergence happened. So again, it sort of became this, they sort of bought into the Horatio Alger's pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality as part of their socialization in these institutions. In terms of policy, I think as Tukufu said, I'm faculty co-director for Penn First Plus, which is our first gen low income initiative. And one of the things that I have felt it very important to do is to remind the institution that in addressing the needs of low income first gen students, we are not simultaneously addressing the needs of students of color. That there are issues among those populations that have nothing to do with money or with a college going orientation in their families, right? And it's easy and comfortable to talk about first gen low income. That's class. We're comfortable in that space. And if you're not careful, institutions slip and they focus all of their attention there, assuming that they're doing what needs to be done for students of color as well, and they're not. So that I am the thorn in the side that is saying, this is great, but it's not addressing this. Yeah. So Kelly, you only get one because you can see me elsewhere.
I hate asking respectfully.
Of course you are.
But
We had some of that. Again, This book is like 400 pages long, so not everything made it. That was not as important. We actually also have information on religion and religiosity that we didn't, it ultimately, there wasn't enough there for us to do it justice. And there were all kinds of time budgets around and questions about how often they felt homesick and when they went home and how much they worked. There's all kinds of stuff that we either had to decide not to include, or there wasn't really enough there to make it count. Mhm. Mhm.
Did you think about that when you're looking at the students who you're calling?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't think you have to, right? These institutions perpetuate that mentality for all students, right? So this is actually just an instance where it's working like it's supposed to, if you really think about it. The other piece, though, is that even though those Blacks' attitudes shifted a little negative, it wasn't a ton, and they still have generally favorable attitudes about Blacks, and they still generally believe that structural factors are more important than cultural factors in explaining persistent Black inequality, right? So yes, there's a shift, but in general, it was more people who had the attitudes we wouldn't want to see at the beginning, moving more towards solidarity later than it was those who had high solidarity attitudes at the beginning moving. Yeah, it's not like you see, oh, a bunch of people who are now Republicans, right? That isn't it. It's much more subtle than that. So, yes.
So you've been following these people for a number of.
We followed them for 4 years, yeah.
Was there an idea about capturing them after university?
Yeah, so Niaja is here. She's working with me and with Rory Kramer, who's one of my co-authors and he's a Penn sociology PhD of mine. So we have a small project. So there were 28 institutions initially. We are reaching out to students at 4 of those institutions. So an Ivy, an elite liberal arts, a flagship state, and our HBCU, to sort of see what their post-college lives have been like. We have information on geographically where they lived when they were growing up. And so I'm kind of curious to see what the racial composition of their current neighborhoods are. We're going to ask questions about sort of movements as life course events. So, were you living in a really diverse place when you were single or childless? And then where did you move when you had to start thinking about schools? And how does that track with the attitudes and the preferences you said you had when you were in college? But the big piece is really sort of what happened right out of college. Right. One of the things I've experienced, I've had like 4 students this semester reach out to me because they graduated, they got a great job, and then they got laid off. Right. Or they graduated and they didn't get a great job. Right. But Penn sells you this, like you graduate from Penn and your life just opens up for you. Right. And so, not everybody has that great experience. And my hunch is that it will fall along pretty predictable racial and class lines. So we want to see how protective was a Penn degree or a Williams degree during the Great Recession, during the COVID pandemic, right? And what has it meant? Who is taking care of extended family? Thinking back to those stressful life events, right? A lot of the qualitative students, they talk about having responsibilities at home. That means that they're never fully in one place, right? They're not fully at school because they're thinking about home. And when they're at home, they're thinking about school. So those are the kinds of things we want to try to capture. And that, maybe if we get lucky and we find out some good stuff, that somebody will give us a lot of money to reach out to more of the schools.
One classic question is, how do you feel about your prospects
compared to parents.
Mhm.
You don't ask them.
We will be asking that, yeah, so we are gonna ask them how they have done relative to their, yes.
Did you ask them while they were in school, how they think they were going to?
I don't
In
think
terms of
that was
their
one of the aspirations, I don't think that that was. So now you've added to the list of things that over the last 25 years, I've thought we should have asked that. Yeah, because we didn't. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I have some experience with this type of stuff. My sister went to Cornell. I went to college in New York,
Mhm.
and then I attended Pittsburgh School of Law. And I remember my experience is very different from my sister, in that my undergrad experience was nowhere near as intense, and I was never as depressed as she was. But then I went to law school. And it hit. Okay, now I know what it's like to be in an elite institution and not feel like you're not measuring. My parents were brought up, so that's like a good relationship. And working class. Having attended Hunter, CUNY, I was able to go to school and see my parents. And that helped me immensely. And a lot of my friends, they live locally. We just were not as stressed and happy as our friends were. So I ask you, given what the several articles in class talking about the ROI, SUNY achievement for minority students, do you think that overall it's better to attend a less prestigious elite school that because of the mental health issues that are associated with elite schools, do you think it's better to not necessarily inspire to attend these?
No, you're not gonna get me on that one. So I think the first thing is that there should not be differential experiences for any student at any of these institutions, and that the problem is the institution, it's not the kids. Period. So, the whole point of Penn First Plus was that the problem is the faculty, right? That we are not considering the varied backgrounds and experiences of our students. Well, that's not limited to whether or not they can afford a $250 textbook, right? Or that we think they should buy all 12 books that we're assigning 2 chapters out of each. Because there are faculty who will say, well, I want them to have a library. Well, that's not your decision, right? The same is true if you think about cultural references that faculty might make in classrooms, or racist remarks, or racist expectations about student ability. So I would first of all, I think college is a personal, the other difference, right, is that in the United States, we talk a lot about fit at the same time that we know that certain kinds of degrees have more value than other kinds of degrees. And so I think that the structures need to change so that all students can have a similar experience. And I would not want to make it harder and more hostile for other groups just so that my misery can enjoy their company. I think that we need to look at the institutions and figure out how to address these issues. Right. And there are institutions that are doing things in much more proactive ways than others in terms of addressing the campus racial climate, addressing anti-racist teaching, and other kinds of, supporting, retaining faculty of color, because students do care to see faculty who look like them and who aren't running themselves ragged doing service work. All of those things matter. And I'm not gonna, I will never be the one to say, well, gosh, maybe you should just go, to Temple instead of going to Harvard. Because yes, there are sort of psychic consequences for these decisions, but there are material consequences. And most of our psychic problems, if we could solve some of the material piece of it, and the structural piece of it, then you don't have as many of the mental health issues. And again, these are not kids who are like, we're breaking them. they're not broken when they get here. So no, I don't. You know, I realize that it doesn't work for everybody. And I know a lot of students who say, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to finish because this piece of paper means something, but I hate it here. Right? So. Yes, Janice, I think you'll be the last question because it's after 6:30. But I'm coming to your. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Well, you know, with the end of affirmative action clearly in sight, we're all going to have to be thinking about what to do on the admissions side of things. You know, I will also say that the disproportionately high number of second generation immigrant Blacks is not an accident. They do score higher in certain areas that have been highly valued. And that's because they come from more affluent origins. They have better educated parents. They come from higher income households. They live in whiter neighborhoods and go to, you know, and when I say whiter, I don't mean that whiter is better just because whiter is better. I mean, because they're wealthier neighborhoods. They have better amenities. They're safer, you know, and the schools are better. So they score higher on the SAT and they take more AP tests and pass them, right? They're not that different on GPA, but somehow in all of this, we started valuing SAT scores more and AP more. And, you know, and I think that there was a time when you could write an essay that said that you did the best you could in a poor school and blah, blah, blah. And you were an urban Black kid like that was the golden ticket. And I think that most of the people in admissions office, most of the time don't look like us. And that story just like triggers white guilt. And an immigrant story is a story that Americans can get with, right? Because we're an immigrant nation, and which is why there are stereotypes in American society that if y'all Black people could be more like those Black people, you wouldn't have this. So, you know, I mean, when I'm in the spaces where I can say things, I say them. Herman knows because he backs me up. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. And sometimes it is saying, and you know, in certain instances, because I work with the Summer Institute, I mean, I've had faculty members call me and say that they didn't believe something that a Black student told them, and they're actually calling me to confirm, and it's like, it's horrifying. And so sometimes it is kind of saying things to people in moments where I can say them. What we have learned through Penn First Plus is that data matters. And so I'm hoping that things like this matter to them, where they can see what's going on. You know, Penn has data that they could share, and, you know, in my next life, maybe I'll get them to do that. But you know, the UC schools had to really think seriously after they ended affirmative action and saw almost all the Black students from UCLA and Cal Berkeley disappear. They actually have Black student initiatives. And, you know, I don't think it would hurt us to have one, honestly. All of it? No. So honestly, I think you got to read the first and second chapters, right? The ones that kind of give you the background. And after that, honestly, I don't think it really matters, because, you know, I was preparing this and I'm like, there's so much gloom and doom here. I mean, you could look for the resilience in it, but it's really sad in a lot of ways. So it almost doesn't matter. if they read the stuff on stress or the stuff on, you know, who graduates and who doesn't, and why. Because I think they'll get the gist of it, and I'll just fill in the gaps. So, we're done. Thank you.